Okay, so we're recording. And if you have any questions, what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to use the chat and send them to Barbara. Is that what we decided?
Yep.
Barbara Miller,
That
okay?
works.
And Barbara will then ask the questions at the end. So I am about to mute everybody. If you have any questions for me, you can send a chat to me if there are any issues. So let me mute everybody. And then I'll unmute Joanne, Barbara and Joanne.
Okay.
Okay, there's Barbara.
Yep. Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you. And
Wonderful.
Joanne, you
Ready?
can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Is Joanne unmuted also?
Everybody else is muted.
Okay.
Okay.
All righty. Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear? Oh, that's right. They can't say that they can hear me. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I have had the pleasure of working with Joanne to plan this program. I want to say that I appreciate how much I've learned by working with her, and it is now my honor to tell you more about her. Joanne Gilbert is a resident of Las Vegas since 2004. She's an award-winning author and public speaker. Joanne grew up in Oak Park, Michigan, a predominantly Jewish suburb of Detroit, inhabited by many Holocaust survivors and their young families. Her earliest memories are of the horrifying and heroic stories they told about their experiences during the Nazi occupation. Joan's most profound influence was her beloved grandmother, Millie Weinman Ron, who was able to leave Vilna, Lithuania before the Germans came, and who never forgave herself for living when her family, along with most of Lithuania's Jewish people, were murdered. Throughout her life, Joanne has been haunted by the often heard refrain, "They went silently like sheep to the slaughter." Convinced that this could not possibly be true, Joanne has dedicated her life since 2010 to finding and celebrating the truth of Jewish heroism during the Shoah. The inspiring results of her mission form the basis of her work, the celebration of the heroic Jews who actively and successfully defied the Nazis and their collaborators. Joanne's first book, award-winning Women of Valor, Polish Jewish Resistors to the Third Reich, was published to outstanding reviews. Her second book, A Victory for Miriam, the little Jewish girl who defied the Nazis, has also received acclaim. Joanne is currently working on her third book, Women of Valor, German, French, and Dutch Resistors to the Third Reich. She is also a consultant for popular sightseekers' delight walking tours of Paris. In developing a tour of the Jewish resistance in Paris, which will be available, it says January 2021, so I'm assuming it's this month. In addition to her frequent speaking engagements for educational, social, religious, and civic organizations in the United States, Canada, and Europe, Joanne is especially honored to have made presentations for many organizations. Just a few are World Federation of Child Holocaust Survivors, the American Library Association, the Krakow Jewish Cultural Festival, and so many more. And Joanne regularly partners with our Sperling Kronberg Mack Holocaust Resource Center in conducting workshops for Clark County, Nevada teachers. And we are just very delighted and honored to have you, Joanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Alan, and the Havurah group, and any other friends that might be tuning in. It's so wonderful that you're interested in learning about women who successfully defied the Nazis. I know many of you had the same experiences that I did growing up when we only learned about the victims, which of course are important, but a whole part of our history was largely unknown. We didn't grow up knowing that the Jews fought and that the Jews were heroes and heroines. And I'm honored to have been able to find some of these people and that they trusted me with their stories. So it's my honor, my pleasure to be able to share that information so that we can carry on their legacy. As Barbara mentioned, I have two published books. One, Women of Valor, Polish-Jewish Resistors to the Third Reich. I was able to interview these women firsthand and became very close with them. At this time, little Miriam, the little girl in the picture that looks like Anne Frank, because that was the hairstyle then, is still living, doing well in Ann Arbor. And her daughter, Javi Mandel, many of you know, is a wonderful artist and therapist who lives in Las Vegas. When Miriam and I finished with Women of Valor, we decided to work on another book, A Victory for Miriam, where we could expand her story. And that became A Victory for Miriam, the little girl who defied the Nazis. She has short hair in the picture because it was important for her to look like a boy when she was living with the partisans so that no one would bother her. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background about a theme that's important to the Jewish community. And it's the theme of being the light in the darkness. When I grew up, I knew about Anne Frank. And when I saw the quote later as an adult that she had said, look, see how the light of a single candle can both defy and define the darkness. That was an illuminating idea for me. We can't solve all the problems. We can't even solve all of our problems, but sometimes we can share a little light and help with the darkness. It's pretty much been my theme and the theme of my presentations. We are told throughout Jewish history to be a light unto all nations. Being a light can take many forms. It can be in terms of being a partisan or a resistor to oppression. It can take the form of being encouragement to someone who's going through a hard time. We've all had people in our lives who have been a light at some point or another. Take a moment and think about who has been the light and who in your life. Who have you been blessed to have as a light for you? And then take a moment and think about when you've been a light for someone else. Pictured is the menorah in front of the Knesset in Jerusalem. Many of you have probably seen it in person. For me, my light was my grandmother, Millie Weinman Rahn. I was fortunate to have her all my life. She lived to 103. During that time, she told me many stories of all the relatives I would never meet. And it seemed so strange when we sat and we looked at the photo albums that she was able to bring because she got out early, and to see all of these people that looked like us, but that we didn't know. And when I was very little, I would snuggle up with her in a big chair. And instead of looking at fairy tales, we would look at these photo albums. On the left, you can see her candlesticks, which she was able to bring with her from Vilna, Lithuania. And the photograph is of my grandmother and my grandfather. It's their engagement photo. And she is an expert seamstress. I'm sure you have many relatives back in the day who were seamstresses and tailors, made both of their outfits. In front of them, some of you may be aware of my friends in Warsaw who create bronze castings of the mezuzah remnants they have found on the doorposts throughout Poland. And I'm able to have one of these bronze castings to show people in person presentations, but we have to be satisfied with the picture for this one. My grandmother always told me stories from the time I was little, and I'm very fortunate to have pictures of us almost in the same position, decades apart. So as an aside, if you have a chance, if you have little ones in your family or whatever age, take a picture in the same pose and then take it again in another year and then another year. These will be absolute treasures for the people who come after you. In the picture on the right in Southfield, Michigan, at that moment, my grandmother and I had been talking. We hadn't seen each other. I'd already moved to San Francisco. We hadn't seen each other. And she had very, very poor vision. And at that moment, for some reason, a ray of sunlight came through the window and she was able to see me. I'm gonna start crying. And she said, oi, Joella, I can see you at that moment. And my aunt was able to capture that picture. So, so precious. If you know anything about the Northwest Detroit area and suburbs, then you know, if you ever have to go on a quiz show, that it was the heavily Jewish community in Detroit. Still is. As I said, my grandmother was able to bring photo albums with her, and I absolutely treasured them. I wanted to walk into the photos and be with those people. I wanted to touch the fringe on that table. And I longed to go back to where our family had lived, never knowing that 60 some years later, I would be able to do just that. The woman on the left is Auntie Rivka, my grandmother's little sister. And as I was growing up, she said, you remind me so much of my little sister who loved to sing, who loved to dance, and who was a teacher. And if you're second generation, maybe you've had a similar experience where if you had a talent or if you had some great skill, somebody would say, oi, that's just like Uncle so-and-so, he should rest in peace, before the Nazis got him. And so I always felt that I was living my life for my Auntie Rivka. I was living the life that she didn't get to live. And I know I'm not alone in that feeling. On the right is my great grandmother, Sarah, and another great aunt, Malka. They did not survive. And many of you know that it wasn't the Nazis who wiped out Vilna so much as it was the Lithuanians under the direction of the Nazis. So I had these questions from my grandmother. Did they fight? Did they just go silently like sheep? Did their neighbors help them? How could these fabulous people just go silently to their deaths? And my grandmother would, say in Yiddish, ich weiß, I don't know. And she'd get tears in her eyes and I'd feel guilty and I'd have to do something to make her laugh. And it wasn't until about 2010 that I was able to actually search for those answers. Did they fight? And yes, they did. And did anyone help them? Yes, they did. We just never heard about them. Here you have a group of partisans, not political partisans like what we've been hearing about, but combat partisans. These are women who fought. They didn't go into the army and get trained. They fought with what they had, and they were trained by whoever knew a little bit more than they did. Some of their weapons were stolen. Some were put together from parts that were stolen. But when they trained, very often all they had were sticks and twigs and rocks to train with. They didn't have a store they could go to get their clothes and their weapons and their rations for going into the forests and becoming a combat partisan. What I'd never known was that there were over 30,000 documented combat partisans. Imagine if we know about 30,000, how many more there must have been. And many of those partisans were in fact women. And they were tough and they were fierce. There's several kinds of resistance. Of course, there's passive resistance. Roped into the passive resistance are things like intellectual, if you are conducting some type of lesson or class, spiritual, if you are relying on religious encouragement, emotional, giving moral support, artistic, drawing pictures that might bring others pleasure, or drawing pictures that might be used as documentation of what was going on. Literary, writing books, keeping journals, and musical, writing tunes, singing songs, all of which were forbidden if you were in a ghetto or a camp, but which Jews managed to do anyway. Way back in 1933 in Kiel, Germany, here's one of the most iconic versions of passive resistance. A Hanukkah on a windowsill, looking out on a Gestapo office. They could have been shot for that. The people did survive, as did the Hanukkah. And the caption for this is, "Death to Judah," the flag says, "and Judah will live forever," so the light answers. And when I read that, I reflected back to Anne Frank. Look how the flame of a single candle can both define and defy the darkness. And the menorah, the Knesset menorah, and how Jews have been called upon to be the light. And then there was active resistance. I never knew there was any. And here we have, right from Vilna, the Abakovner group. They were fierce. The Germans hated them. And if you look closely, you can see there are almost as many women as men in this group. Before the Third Reich came into being, Abakovner was an intellect and a poet. And he became a very fierce leader of the resistance. And the originator of that phrase about going silently like sheep, he said, "Join me, do not go silently like sheep to the slaughter." We didn't get the full context. We only heard the end of that particular phrase. I often wondered if anyone in my family had been with Kovner's Avengers. Active resistance took many, many forms. The image shows a blown up Schlafenwagen, sleeping wagon, and it was full of German personnel and material. And one of the most successful active forms of resistance was creating little Molotov cocktails out of bottles and gasoline and rags and sticking them under the railroad tracks and lighting them and then running like crazy to get away and exploding the tracks and the cars. And the Avengers and other resistance groups were very successful at this. Many, many other ways of being an active resistor. The women were particularly adept at being couriers. They were able to hide information on their bodies before the Germans caught on, particularly under maternity clothes, making it look like they were pregnant, but really they were taking coupons and forged ID papers and all kinds of intelligence information. Often they were very young and maybe they would be riding on a bicycle with their braids flying out behind them. Every once in a while, if they were very young and very pretty, and perhaps taking a suitcase of flyers, anti-Nazi flyers on a train, occasionally a young, handsome German soldier would even help them with that suitcase. They would set up black market stores where people could trade goods. They smuggled food, medicine, weapons, weapon parts. They set up in the ghettos and even in some of the camps, schools or facsimiles of schools, because learning is so important. They maintained synagogues to the degree that they could. They substituted whatever they had, even if it was a match instead of a candle. They were ardent and they did not give up. Another thing that the women were very good at was breaking codes. Remember, they didn't have cell phones. They didn't even have telephones unless they were hidden. They did have radios, which they weren't allowed to have, very often in an attic. And when the radio was broadcasting, little kids, sometimes 5, 6 years old, would be out on the street underneath the window, playing with marbles or rocks, because when the Germans, who had a radar radio sensor antenna on their trucks, would start coming and searching for the radios, the kids would see them and they would throw their rocks or their marbles at the window as a signal that the Germans were coming. Everybody was in on the resistance. Other actions that were important in active resistance were forging documents, particularly when Hungary was still free and an ally of Germany. There were forging operations that were able to give people fake documents attesting to the fact that they were Hungarian, and they were able to be freed from the ghettos. If you know Ben Lesser, his sister Lola was one of those forgers, and she was able to forge they were all in the ghetto, about to be deported, and she was able to forge documents and get part of her family and many other people out of that ghetto. Stealing food, hiding, if you were not Jewish. This didn't happen very often, as we all know, but there were circumstances where Gentile friends would actually hide the possessions of their Jewish friends and return them afterwards. There were also situations, again, very rare, where a Gentile friend would take over ownership of a Jewish business and allow the Jewish former owner to still work and earn money from it. And then if that person survived, return it to them. I'm not aware of that ever happening, the after the war return, but I am aware of situations where a Gentile took over ownership. Let's see, another kind of resistance. It was if you were a Gentile family with a barn in the backyard, and maybe there was a Jewish family hiding there, and you didn't do much, but you didn't turn them in. And maybe you left some blankets in the barn door, and maybe you left some food. And so there were instances of active Gentile resistance. When I began my research, I didn't have a clue where it was going to take me. I was afraid that no one would respond and that I would be a failure at finding women of valor. I didn't have any particular credentials. I didn't have any connections, but it seemed as if the story had taken hold of me and was pushing me along. And every time I said to myself, oh, I can't do this. Oh, I can't do that, the story would slap me a couple times and say, just go do it. And so I just went and did it. And one of the first women that I was honored to meet was Manya Feldman. And the irony was that she lived right in Oak Park, Michigan, where I grew up, and her kids went to neighboring schools. But we didn't know. People didn't talk about what they did during the Holocaust. So we didn't know. Manya, when she was very young, probably 13, was living in the ghetto with her family. And what she didn't know was that her father and her older siblings were making plans to escape. They were waiting for a signal. And one night there was a signal, knock on the window, time to go. And she saw her older brother, older sister, and her father getting ready to leave. And it was like, what's happening here? And they told her they were leaving for the forest, but that they were going to leave Manya and her mom and the two little ones there until they found a safe place. And Manya decided she was going to go too. And when I interviewed her, she was 94, and you could see her become that 13-year-old waving goodbye to her mother and her two little sisters, who she would never see again. She went to the forest. They were at some point hidden by 12th, Adventists who were also oppressed by the Nazis. And when she joined with partisans, she was trained for combat. She wore one of those bullet belt things. I don't know what they're called. And she carried 80-pound packs. And she was tough. She was very active in creating those Molotov cocktails to bomb trains. And then she said to me, and then I ran like hell. Sometimes the Germans would see me and they would shoot, and I just flew like the wind. And she did. She was in terrible danger several times. And I would ask her, well, how come you were able to survive? And she said, I was just lucky. No one was looking out for me. I was just lucky. And as I heard her story, and if you've read the book, you'll notice every time she almost dies, something really strange happens and she gets lucky and survives. One point she was left to die because she had typhus, which was very common. There was no cure for typhus then. And the partisans weren't babysitters. They couldn't take you with them. You were a drag on them. They couldn't fight. So she was left in the snow. Somehow she crawled to a little village. It was completely empty. They'd been warned that the Germans were coming. And she crawled into a house and she fell asleep in the fireplace. And she thought she had been asleep over a week, delirious with typhus. And one morning woke up to the sound of male German voices. So she figured, well, that's it. You know, they're going to rape me. They're going to kill me. This is it. Okay, fine. That's the way it's going to be. Well, she was able to pass for Polish, which is one of the major skills that all of the resistors told me. They had multiple language skills. And it wasn't just the language, it was the entire zeitgeist of a culture. So that they knew if there was a sports team, they knew recipes, they could inhabit a different culture and fake out the Germans. So she decided she would at least pretend to be a crazy, stupid Polish girl. She knew the Germans would expect a crazy Polish, stupid girl, and they did. And they didn't know she could understand them, their German. And they asked her in broken Polish German if she could cook. And she said, sure. And they took out such a banquet that she hadn't seen in almost a year. And there she was, humming Polish tunes and cooking breakfast for German soldiers. And they let her eat with them. And she figured, oh, they don't want me to be hungry before they rape me and kill me. Apparently, however, they were German soldiers, not Nazis. There was a distinction. And when they were through, they left. And so she was stunned and she cleaned up. And when she was sure they were long gone, she got her backpack together and went back to the forest and rejoined another partisan group. She ended up at Liberation, ending up in a DP camp in Germany, where she met her husband, who was very active and successful in the black market after the war, particularly in cigarettes. They married. They lived in Germany for several years while they were waiting to be able to come to the States. There was quite a survivor community in Detroit, and that's where they ended up. And she ended up getting trained to become a Hebrew teacher. She also was part of the original group in founding the Holocaust Memorial Museum out in Farmington Hills. And there's a whole section devoted to her in the lower level. Manya. One time I was telling Manya about all the problems I was having at my age, getting around. At one point, I was with a walker in Poland and I didn't understand anything. And I was kind of whining a little bit. And she looked at me and she said, well, why are you doing this? And I said, because you trusted me with your stories. I have to do it. And besides, look what you did. You lived in ditches. You had leeches on you from swamps. You were shot at. How can I not collect the stories? And she reached over and held my hand and she said, yeah, but I was 15. You're 60. Oh, okay. I'm not 15 anymore. That was a surprise. So she didn't talk a lot, but when she did, it was absolutely on point. And she passed away in 2015, and I miss her profoundly. Faye Schulman, who is still living, just celebrated her 100th birthday. Before I tell you about her, look at those eyes. The top picture was her high school graduation picture. The bottom picture I took, I think in 2014. Her eyes are magical. She sees everything. And she sees if you're a jerk. She doesn't suffer fools lightly. She is a tough, tough, amazing woman. She has awards from many countries for her work as a partisan. She is a hero. And she joined the partisans. It was kind of a circuitous route. Her older brother had been trained as a photographer because Jewish boys weren't allowed to go to school, so they were sent to learn a trade. So he was sent to the larger town nearby and learned to be a photographer. And he came home and set up a dark room. And occasionally he would let Faye help. You know, like the little sister was pestering him, let me help, let me help. Okay, fine. He would let her help with a little this, a little that. But otherwise, she didn't know much about developing photos in the darkroom. And one day she went to the next village to play cards with her girlfriends who lived there. Of course, they also were not allowed to go to school. And when she came back, her entire neighborhood was empty. The Jews had been taken out. And she was 14. Think about when you were 14. And she just looked around her empty house and didn't know what to do. And then she heard in the doorway those boots, those tall, black leather boots, so big in the memories of anyone who's crossed paths with a Nazi, those boots. And she turned around and she was maybe 4'11". She turned around and she looked up to this giant in the doorway and his German Shepherd dog. And she figured, okay, this is it. But it wasn't. He looked at her and he said, I see you have a dark room. Are you a photographer? And she said, of course, I'm a trained photographer. And he let her live. 2,000 of the Jews in that little town did not get to live. 26 were considered useful. You know what that means. If you're useful to the Germans, they let you live. And 26, she was one of the 26. And they decided, since she was such a trained photographer, that they would use her to document their atrocities. Now, if you didn't know she was being forced to do it, you might think she was a collaborator. And it's an important distinction because there were women in the resistance. They had to hide their resistance activities. And other people who were maybe hiding or underground or passing as Gentile wouldn't necessarily know that that woman who's hanging out with the Germans is a spy. And they might be very angry with her and could even kill her. Because they figured she's a collaborator. So that's a part of the story I never had realized. So there is Faye, a young teenager taking pictures for the Nazis. And while she was doing it, she made duplicates so that there would be a record. And she buried the duplicates. They gave her a little freedom so she could go to her dark room in her house. And while she was doing that, she made a little side trip and buried stolen cameras, developer chemicals, and her duplicate prints on the edge of the forest. And one day the Germans came and they said, "Oh, Faye, you're working so hard." And she knew what that meant. They said, "We're going to give you a little Ukrainian girl to help you." So she knew the little Ukrainian girl was going to replace her very soon. And she decided that while she was training the girl, she would deliberately leave out important steps in the developing process, in the photography process. And the Germans would come, "Why isn't she trained?" And Faye would go, "Who knows? She's stupid. She can't follow directions." And she bought herself a little bit of time. And then one night she knew she had to go. There was a signal. She knew she had to go, and she took off for the forest. And the Soviet partisans didn't want her. And she said, "But my brother-in-law was a doctor. I used to work in his office. I can be a medic." And they went, "Oh, okay, fine, you're our medic." And they made her the nurse. She ended up assisting in surgeries outside under fire. She also ended up being the only partisan to take actual photographs of what was going on in the Soviet partisan camp. And her photographs are now a worldwide traveling exhibit sponsored by the San Francisco Partisan Education Foundation. And if we can ever meet in person again, we can probably bring that exhibit here. It's breathtaking. I was honored to present it at the Detroit Jewish Book Festival a couple of years ago. And in the audience was Faye's nephew, who she hadn't seen for years. And there he was looking at his aunt's life with his relatives in a total stranger's PowerPoint. It was an extraordinary experience. She also has a documentary called Out of the Fire, where the documentarian Shelley Saywell finally talked Faye after 10 years into going back to Poland, where she never wanted to set foot, and having a reunion with other living partisans from her group.
Wow.
By then she was 85. They were all Altsakakers too, in their 90s and older, and some were Jewish and some were not Jewish. And this documentary is breathtaking. And of course I have a copy, and I hope at some point I'll be able to share it with you, looking at these fierce fighters having this reunion. She gets pissed off when someone says there wasn't a Holocaust, and she says, "I have the photos. I have proof." Here we have Faye in a gorgeous leopard fur coat and hat. And if you've read the book, you know how she got it. Apparently it dropped off a truck coming over the border from the Soviet Union. And that coat and hat saved her by keeping her warm, where other people would freeze to death in the brutal cold winters. She ended up, I kept saying to her, "Well, what happened to the coat? What happened to the coat?" She said, "Well, when we were liberated, I had to throw it away. Because if I went to a DP camp and I looked like a rich lady, they'd beat me up and take it. And if someone who was not Jewish saw it, they would take it and wear it. And I won't say the word she used, but she didn't want a Gentile woman wearing her gorgeous coat. So she threw it out." You see pictures of resistance in the flyer for her exhibit. And she does. She looks like a movie star with, like Gladys Knight and the Pips with her 3 backup singers, one of whom became her husband, a very wonderful, gorgeous, brilliant partisan fighter. I was very lucky to be able to get this photo from Faye's granddaughter, Rochelle, who is just about to enter law school. And Rochelle and I talked about her grandmother and the impression that her grandmother made on her, the influence. And Rochelle said that it's her hope she can carry on her grandmother's legacy by becoming an attorney who will fight for justice for the underdog, and be the voice for the voiceless. And you can see she inherited amazing eyes as well. Third woman I was lucky to meet, Lola Lesser-Lieber. I was fortunate enough to meet her through Ben, and she lived in Borough Park in Brooklyn. And she was a very, very respected artist. She had her own art gallery in Borough Park. And her experience was completely different than the others. She wasn't in the resistance or the partisans or any of those kinds of physically hostile fighting situations. Why? Because she was blonde, blue-eyed, and gorgeous. She looked like a Gabor sister, and she talked like a Gabor sister. And you can see in this photo when she's just about 90 that she was gorgeous for her entire life. She was on the run for 6 years, which meant changing identities often. Fortunately, because they had relatives in areas that were partially Czechoslovakia, partially Poland, partially Hungary, it depended on the day, she was familiar with the cultures of all 3 countries. And when they were about to be deported from the ghetto, they noticed that she was speaking Hungarian, and the clerk, the German clerk, said, "Oh, are you from Hungary?" And she said, "Oh, absolutely." And he started grilling her. "Well, what's your favorite Hungarian goulash recipe?" And darn if she didn't know one. And she was just a kid. And she told him the recipe. And he said, "Well, I guess you are." And she was able to be taken to the Gestapo headquarters, which was in a gorgeous home, formerly owned by a wealthy Jewish family. And she knew she was going to get killed at that point, but no, the commandant said, "No, you are Hungarian. You can take that armband off. You're free." And she said, "But what about my family? They're Hungarian too." And he said, "Okay." And he made arrangements for the family to also be released, whereupon they moved out of the ghetto and they began a factory manufacturing fake IDs. She was able to save the Babover rabbi and his family. They would have been the end of the line. They reestablished the dynasty in Borough Park. There are hundreds of them now, thanks to Lola. She said, "I wasn't a hero." And every single one of these women that I spoke to said, "Don't call me a hero," because every single one of them, for what they did in terms of survival themselves, in terms of helping other people, who did they think about? All the ones they couldn't help, all the ones that didn't make it. So where we would think they're heroes, they all felt to a certain degree like failures because of the people they weren't able to help. She says, "I was never a hero. I was just a regular person trying to do the right thing. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't." Here are a couple of examples of some of her gorgeous paintings. She paints in many different styles, and her memoir, A World After This, which is a very beautiful memoir, which you can get via her website. I have a couple of copies, and I think Ben has a couple of copies. Just a beautiful, beautiful book. If you go to the Holocaust Resource Center under the directorship of Susie Dubin, which is now located at Beth Shalom, you will see other pictures of Lola's paintings.
Beautiful.
Miriam Brisk, the little girl who looked like Anne Frank but had a completely different experience. She was the little girl who escaped the Warsaw ghetto and ended up in the Lida ghetto, which was like across the street from the Soviet Union. And then with her parents escaped in the middle of the night. Why? Because her father was a famous surgeon. And the partisans in the forest decided they needed a hospital in the forest. And they decided to come and get Dr. Myasnik. And he was a short little guy. And these were kind of tall partisans. And they were out after curfew, which they could have all been shot, on the street. And the partisans said, yo, Doc, we're taking you to the forest right now so that you can help us build a hospital. And he said, no, not doing it. And they proceeded to have the equivalent of a silent argument, because if anyone heard them, that would have been it. Anyway, he wore them down, David and Goliath. He wore them down and said, I'll go if I can bring my wife and my little girl. And they argued some more and he prevailed. And in the middle of the night, he was able to get Miriam, who was 7, and his wife, and they busted out. It's an amazing trek they went on, and made it to the forest, where eventually Dr. Myasnik built his hospital. And they did surgeries and took care of sick people. And Miriam, little as she she had functions of her own. She was no longer a child, that was gone. She helped her dad by boiling surgical instruments. She helped by gathering wood and twigs and branches for fires. And she was able to scurry up trees and act as a lookout. Whatever she did, she had to act like she was a boy, because a little girl could have been hurt in that environment. She was almost like a feral wolf child because she had no education. She could speak about 6 languages, but she had no education. And when liberation came, they were on the Soviet side, and the Soviets were not very nice. And they were happy to have a doctor, but they could tell him to do whatever they wanted. He wasn't able to earn his own money. They told him where they were going to live. If they wanted him to move with no notice, the family would be uprooted. It was a really bad situation. So once again, they had to escape in the middle of the night, and they trekked across Europe, through Poland again, through Germany of all places, until they ended up in Italy in a DP camp. Eventually, Miriam and her family were able to come to America. She was looking forward to the promised land, the golden land, excuse me, the land of freedom, where everybody could be who they were supposed to be. And she was in for a shock, because the promised land was Brooklyn, and she didn't speak Brooklyn. And the girls were mean. They were mean young teenagers. And she didn't know from Frank Sinatra. And she didn't know from any of the things that all these girls knew about. And they considered her a greenie, a greenhorn. And she was sad. And they thought there was something wrong with her. And she couldn't speak English. And the teachers thought there was something wrong with her. Imagine being given a book to read in a language you didn't understand. So she was labeled a reluctant learner, and it was awful. And it was, in fact, traumatizing for her to be treated that way. But she showed them all. She graduated high school. She graduated college early. She went on and became a renowned scientist and a medical school professor. And when she retired, because what an extraordinary woman, she got bored and decided to become a fine artist and then a graphic artist. She also decided to write some books, and I was honored to be her editor and to help her with those books. She also became a poet. So Miriam has been very busy and continues to be busy. Here are some of the books that we worked on together. Etched in My Memory, The Stones Weep is an education book with lesson plans for Holocaust education across the curriculum. These books are available on Amazon. And she's had many art exhibits. The center is a flyer for one of her beautiful exhibits, In a Confined Silence. And I was lucky again to get a photo of Miriam with her precious granddaughter, Sarah. Look at those faces. Take some pictures, people. You never know. They might end up in a slideshow. That is just gorgeous. Some of you might have been at our book launch of A Victory for Miriam at Midbar, hosted by Susie when the Holocaust Resource Center was there. And Miriam and her husband flew in from Michigan, and we had a wonderful, wonderful book launch. As Miriam's story tells us, heroes come in all sizes and all ages. It's my hope and Miriam's hope that you will share her legacy by sharing her story with others. I always stop at this point. Let us catch our breath, reflect a little bit on everything that I've shared, and think about what it takes to be the light in somebody's life. For Martin Niemöller, a non-Jewish pastor, he eventually was jailed for his efforts in helping the Jews. And he wrote a little poem that many of us have seen, but it's so, so powerful because his way of being the light is encouraging us to speak up for injustice. First, they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't speak up. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me. And by that time, no one was left to speak up. And so whatever way we can be the light, whether it's speaking up, whether it's being encouraging, whether it's fighting in a partisan group, how wonderful if we could all be the light for somebody. How wonderful if we could all take the words of Anne Frank and let our little flame both defy and define the darkness. And here's a little commercial. If you are interested in helping the legacy of these women, I have 2 books published and available, and a 3rd hopefully coming. My final research for my 3rd book, of course, had to be postponed. All of my trips to Europe this past year had to be canceled. So it's still in the works. But again, Women of Valor, Polish Jewish resistors to the Third Reich, they were all teenagers and younger, and they survived. They all went on to have long, loving, productive lives, all of them involved in Holocaust education in some way, in honor of those who didn't survive and in honor of the other victims and survivors. And there is my card. I would be happy to respond to anyone who wants to contact me with information, with questions. If you belong to book clubs or other organizations that might want a speaker, if you feel what the story that I've been able to share is worth sharing, please do contact me. And once again, thank you, Alan, for your tech support and your leadership, and Barbara for organizing it all. And thank you all for joining us tonight.
Gosh.
Thank you.
Unmute me. Unmute.
So Alan's going to stop the share, yeah?
There you are.
All righty.
Ah, now I can see everybody. Okay.
Why can't we see you, Barbara?
I don't know, but it's okay. You hear me. But Alan, well, obviously you guys can hear me now. Yeah, I don't know why, but oh my gosh, I'm verklempt here. Thank you so much, Joanne, for coming and no, oh no, you didn't come, but for taking your time and effort that went into planning this. And I will let you know, Joanne already knows how she's influenced me. I'm almost halfway. I've read the other book and I'm almost halfway through Victory from Miriam, and I can't put it down. There's the suspense and the description is amazing. And when just the theme of, I just wanted to share that even the smallest subtle actions. In the book, when Miriam, they're telling the story of when she's in the, give me 1 second here, I have it right here, in the ghetto, the Lita, is that how you pronounce it? I hope, Lita ghetto.
Yeah.
With her family, resistance, I mean, now my consciousness was sharpened to what is resistance, what resistance could be. And she talked about, how they adapted to the horrible conditions, the crowded conditions, and they adapted. And I think it's a form of resistance, establishing routines, learning to squelch one's own feelings to make things easier, trying to cooperate. And because I had read her both books, I could see, yes, those just surviving was a form of resistance.
Yes, absolutely.
So I just wanted to share that. I don't see any questions unless I'm not doing it right. But did anybody, you raising your hand? Did anybody see? Because Alan can see you. Did anybody have a question? Well,
I have a question.
Okay. Whoever-
This is Marnie. Joanne, did you ever know of or hear of a member of the Dutch resistance named Tony van Rentergem?
No, I'm sorry. Tell me more about the person. I'd love to know more.
He was a neighbor of mine when I lived in Sequim, Washington. He died several years ago, but he would, when he was able to, when he was still healthy, he would go and speak like at schools and talk about his experience. And because he was very young during the war. And one of the things that I remembered was that he would be riding his bike and he would have a pack on the handlebars, and there'd be a hole and he would have a camera.
Yes.
And he'd be riding around. And the way to show the Germans that you were not a threat was to go up and talk to them and be friendly with them.
Yep,
And
exactly.
it was just amazing to hear those stories. And he also had some interesting insights about the anti-Semitism from our presidential families and things like that.
Oh, yeah. I know when many of us grew up, the older people in our families often would have pictures of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt,
Right.
like he was a big hero. And it was only later that we learned that he didn't really help the Jewish people. And it's interesting how vulnerable we are to the prevailing media story of current events. We only know what the media tell us, and we can invest so much of our emotions and our intellect into something that's an utter fallacy.
Right. And
So
apparently the Bush family is apparently involved with the Nazis.
well, that's another presentation. But
Okay, please do it.
It's interesting, Marnie, that his name is Van. Was he in the Netherlands?
Yes.
Okay, and my next book involves the resistance in the Netherlands, and I've spent a great deal of time in Amsterdam doing research there, and I'm so looking forward to that. So thank you.
Okay. He has written a book. It was published in Dutch. His wife and son live in Ashland, and I just saw her website. If you want, if you want to connect with them and let someone know, let me know. But yeah, I don't know if the book has been translated into English. But he was a fascinating man, and I know that his wife would probably be able to help you out if you want.
Yeah. Well, I would be interested. I've just put my email in the chat box. If you could find out if the book is in English, that would be very helpful. Thank you. All right.
Any other questions? You just shout out because I.
Yeah, hi.
Gary has a question.
Yes.
Hi, Gary. Hi, Gary.
You mentioned in your talk, excuse me, that the German soldiers, as opposed to the German Nazis, it seems like most of the soldiers had to be Nazis or else.
There was a point where at the beginning, where they were actually German soldiers and they hadn't become part of the Nazis yet. So there were some groups who were just German soldiers. It didn't last long.
Yeah, I imagine if they found any, they said, convert or die, right?
Yeah, right, right. Gary, you've seen how many, is this my second or third presentation?
My third for you.
Your third. You and your wife could probably lip sync my presentation. Thank you for
Not quite.
joining us. I hope that there was something new and interesting in this one. And thank you so
It was
much for
very
coming.
interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very, very good.
Yes. Am I still on? I'm still on, right?
Yes,
Can you guys hear?
yes.
Okay. It's Barbara. Since Gary shared that, I also wanted to share that I learned so much when I read, oh my gosh, your other book, Women of Valor, and what and one of the things that really struck me was I didn't realize that the first people who were killed, that one of the reasons, that the first people who were taken away, killed, or sent to the camps, were a lot of times were the leaders, were teachers, were respected people, and men. I mean, that was something I'd never really known before, or heard, and it makes sense because when you want to control people, you want to get rid of their leaders who might be reasonable,
Exactly.
yeah, that was
Exactly. Actually, the first people in Poland to be taken were Polish. And then they came for the Jews. And guess how they knew who the Jewish leaders were in Poland?
I have no idea.
Yeah, it was because they had prototypes of computer punch cards from IBM.
Wow.
And they had all kinds of data on who the leaders were in every Jewish community, major Jewish community. They were able to round them up very quickly.
Wow.
You take the leaders, and what have you got? You have people who you can control. And again, the media, very important. Technology, such as it was at that time, very, very important.
And you left the women also. That was something else I got.
That
Any
they what the women?
And there were mostly women left in some of the towns.
The women were left, yes. It was a world without men.
They were heroes.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, the last comment I wanted to make before I tell you all about upcoming programs is I want to once again thank Joanne. Joanne, thank you. I think I got these words once from Susie Dubin, who I don't think was able to get on the Zoom. I know, but we had a discussion once about overdoing the Holocaust, or being over Holocausted out, and so some of these words are hers and some are mine. I want to thank you for doing this important work. Thank you for telling the women's story.
Thank you so much for allowing me to do it. I hope my work has value for others, and again, that you will continue this legacy by sharing these stories. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. And I don't think it can be told enough. I made a comment to you when we were chatting last week that the number of survivors is decreasing daily, and we have to make sure that the generations to come don't get swallowed up in this. The Holocaust never happened. We have to make sure that the stories are told and it's documented, because it did. It is real,
Exactly.
and we have to make sure that it never is forgotten. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it. I'm going to ask our programming coordinators, Marilyn and Hart, I see Marilyn, and, oh, there's Hart. If you could unmute yourselves and tell us about what we have to look forward to. I see Marilyn. Where's Hart?
Art, speak.
Hart, you have to unmute yourself.
Well, I think Barbara knows the next speaker.
Okay,
Doesn't
I'm
appear that
unmuted. I
Barbara's
think
on.
Barbara, I sent Barbara the information.
Right.
Barbara,
Okay.
you still there?
I do not see Barbara.
Yeah, she had it. I think
Oh, wait,
she was
she's coming.
supposed to speak.
She's
Sorry.
was-
coming back. Here she comes.
Okay.
Here she comes.
Is she coming back?
She's
Barbara,
calling
would
me and
you,
she's coming
do you
back.
want to present the next programs coming? I'm not ready, but I mean, I can do it.
Where's Barbara? She just.
Barbara,
Unmute, Barb. Unmute.
This is high tech here. Barbara?
Yes, I'm here.
You
I'm
have to
here.
unmute. Okay.
Barbara, would you like to tell them about the upcoming programs for us, or did you?
I would love to.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
It
Unmuted.
just kicked me out. On our next event is in February, and it's February 10th at 6 p.m. And we will be, our guest speaker is Dr. Arthur Ross. And Dr. Arthur Ross from Winnipeg wrote about, did research about the theme is communal solidarity, how the immigrants from Europe, the Jewish immigrants came, and how they established a life, how between the institutions, the societies, the organizations, how they created a life and shaped a life which was not easy, especially when they weren't welcomed. And of course, even though this is Winnipeg, it certainly can be compared to so many other places where Jews came as immigrants. So that's in February, and Dr. Ross, it sounds like it's going to be an excellent speaker. And I believe we're going to see a video first. Is that right, Marilyn? I think, right?
There's
We'll
a
see.
video part of the program.
Yes, it's fabulous. I watched it. Unbelievable. You're going to
Right.
learn a lot.
And then in March, on March 3rd, speaking of our own Susan Dubin, who, by the way, just on the 12th was named the Jewish Educator of the Year by Jewish Nevada. Susan is going to present one of her beloved programs that I've heard so much about. She's going to speak about her book, Kol Isha, Voice of the Woman, and a little bit of what that's about. In the Bible, most of the memorable characters are male. In truth, however, many women people the pages of this story as well. In this work of poetry, Susan Dubin gives a voice to major and minor female characters. Although biblical women lived thousands of years ago, their feelings are universal. It is time for the voices of women in the Bible to be heard. And in case you didn't know, Susan is the library director and education specialist at the Sperling Kronberg Mack Holocaust Resource Center in Las Vegas. And that's
Barbara, excuse me, does everyone know that it's relocated? Does everyone know where it's located now at Beth Shalom?
I would bet, unless they listened to me at one of our membership meetings, I would bet they didn't know it was near us. It was. Yes, it's in Summerlin now, right?
It's in Temple Beth Shalom in Summerlin, which is wonderful for us in Sun City, Summerlin, not so wonderful for you guys. But Susie tells me it's not a long ride at all, up to 15. The benefit there is that they have the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Garden. And
Oh.
if you haven't been there, it's breathtaking. And she is able to arrange to have groups come in to that garden. And the story around it is fascinating. And so well worth your time in finding out about that. And she's done a great job setting up the Holocaust Resource Center
Right.
there as well. So.
And again, if some of you don't know, if you you might not know that she trains Clark County teachers how to teach the Holocaust. So she's
Yes.
our gem, another one of our gems. And I just want to say, I'm so glad some of you were able to get in. I'm sorry, I feel terrible that whether, maybe some people couldn't, including Susan, because she called me. And if any of you have ideas for programs, please let Hart and Marilyn Horwee know. They are the chairs of our programming committee, or let Alan know, or let me know, let anybody know. We will help. You don't have to do the work yourself. We will help you coordinate it, but certainly we love getting new ideas. And and this is because I got to meet Joanne a couple of years ago, and I finally read the book and said, oh my gosh, we've got to have her here. And thank you so much for all the time you spent helping me get this organized.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, then, Alan, do you want to wish everybody good night?
I will be happy to do that. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Joanne. I want to thank Hart and Marilyn for the energy that you're putting in to make Havurah function during this time of, there are so many adjectives that I could use to describe it. And Barbara, thank you for making the match. And we look forward to seeing everybody in person at some point, hopefully before the end of the summer. We can do something together. Everybody get vaccinated, stay healthy, and we'll see you all when we see
Thank
you.
you.
So,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again.
Good night, all.
Okay, I have to go give hubby dinner. Bye, Bert.
And Joanne, I will be in touch about the recording.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Bernice.
I will connect with you, Joanne. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Barb.
Because
All right.
one of these days I want you to sign my books.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, let's see when
Thank you.
here, let me turn video on again. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Look what I did.
Bernice,
all right. Go
Look
to
at you.
virtual.
bye.
Go to the
All
up
right, we'll see
carrot
everybody.
next
I'm ending
to,
the meeting.
Yeah, the virtual background.
Take care.
yeah,
Some setting
choose-
is wrong though. Yeah, go on.
but choose none.
Yeah, I know. But I want the virtual to work.
Oh, you can do makeup now if you go to the beta,
How do you get to beta?
same place, one slot lower.
Yeah, but I want to know why
I am going to end the meeting. You two will have to chat on your own.
okay,
All
you
right.
can still
figure it
stay,
out.
right?
Bye.
If I
Yeah, don't
if I
end the
end the
meeting,
meeting-
Alan. We'll close
No?
it out.
see, if I choose virtual background
Yeah,
and I'm just, oh, there's no noise now. Okay, and if I choose one, I get noise. What's causing that?
it has to do with movement. Now watch this. I'll do something. I'll show you for me. Let me choose a virtual background.
I know yours works.
Where are you going to choose this?
You got to
No.
download them.
Oh,
Okay,
So you
Oh,
have one.
nice.
Can I get a copy of that one?
you can all have this. I'll explain in a minute, but let's see what's happening with Burma. But you see,